Hello, everyone. My name is Sherry Paula Watkins, and as Executive Director of the North Carolina Humanities, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's North Carolina Reads Book Club discussion of Poster Girls with Meredith Ritchie and Dr. Sarah Patterson. This is our second book discussion to our 2024 North Carolina Read series, and we are so glad you are here. We started North Carolina Reads in 2022 because at North Carolina Humanities, we believe in the power of books, reading, and stories. Now in his third year, North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equity and the history and culture of North Carolina. We hope that tonight you feel connected to our guest speakers and each other, and are inspired to think about and empathize with the stories and experiences of others. Thank you again for being here this evening. Now it is my pleasure to turn this event over to Melissa Giblin, Director of the North Carolina Center for the Book, to finish our introductions for tonight. Melissa?
Thank you, Sherry Paula. I am Melissa Giblin, and I am so excited to begin this evening's conversation. As a nonpartisan statewide nonprofit and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission at NC Humanities is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated discussion on Poster Girls, which is our 2024 North Carolina Read selection for March. As a note about this evening's program, North Carolina Reads books are intended for readers 18 and over, and this program contains content that may be sensitive to some. We would like to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities, the State Library of North Carolina, and McGuire Woods for their sponsorship support of this year's program. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel. All 5 of the 2024 North Carolina Reads book events will be available on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to that channel at NC Humanities. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab. I can see a lot of folks are telling us where they're joining from. So from North Carolina and beyond, welcome to this evening's event. Closed captions are available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging at NC Humanities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now I will turn this program over to Laura Demski Williams, who is this evening's moderator.
Thank you, Melissa. I am happy to be here, and I want to introduce our speakers for tonight's discussion. Our author is Meredith Ritchie. Her historical fiction novel takes place in North Carolina, right here in North Carolina, during World War II, and is based on true but mainly forgotten events. When Meredith's triplets left for college, she wrote this women's empowerment story, Poster Girls, as a cure for acute empty nest syndrome, which I'm not looking forward to. But anyway, a lifelong learner, Meredith believes history told in the form of stories can never be forgotten, especially history that happened in our own backyard. She lives in Charlotte with her husband, cats, chickens, and grown adults that occasionally return to her cozy coop. Thank you for being here, Meredith. Our other panelist today is Dr. Sarah Patterson. Dr. Sarah Patterson is a teaching assistant professor in the Department of History at East Carolina University in Greenville. Her major fields of teaching and research are U.S. history, U.S. military history, and gender. She is currently working on her first book focusing on 20th century Marine Corps history and gender. Again, thank you both for being here. We're excited to have this discussion. Okay, so I am going to begin with a few questions. The first one is for Meredith. For those who have not read the book yet or may need a refresher, please tell our audience briefly what the book is about.
It is It's a women's empowerment story, but it's also wrapped in this wonderful friendship between two women who have many things in common, but they're both, rule followers. And it's one of the things they have in common. And I wanted to explore how some of the rules of society would affect both of them. Those could be Jim Crow laws, those could be, women in the workforce, what have you. And I really wanted to show how when some of those rules change, some of the connections that can be made, and how it was too brief of a time period when it was when it happened. So,
Great, thank you. And then Sarah, can you explain some of the larger historical context of military plants like the shell assembly plant, which I was personally not even previously aware of during World War II?
Sure. So the military production plants popped up all over the country. They were vitally important to the Allied success in World War II by virtue of being able to churn out just the mass quantity of ammunition and weapons and various other supplies that the military needed for every little thing that they did. And not only were the US plants actually providing logistical support for American troops, they were actually providing a lot of supplies for various other Allied groups as well. So the immense amount of production that was needed in order to supply multiple militaries was the reason why we have so many of these brand new plants like the Shell plant in Charlotte that pop up practically overnight.
mm-hmm.
Additionally, we also see that there are a lot of existing plants that are sort of repurposed during the war for various production that is a little bit more specified toward the war itself. So there are a lot of, trying to think of a good example actually, but there's a lot of plants.
Detroit moved from making cars to making tanks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect example. And those were happening all over the country as well. So everything that could be was being sort of put toward this war production status, trying to provide all of these supplies for all of these troops from multiple armies that were going to all different places all over the globe.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Cora and Maggie, two of the main characters, experience feeling like outsiders at various points in the story because they both moved to Charlotte from other places. How does their friendship and their work at the plant help them feel connected with their community? And maybe Meredith, I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, I have a strong value in community. I was born in Charlotte. I also moved around a little bit when I was growing up, and so I experienced being somewhere new. My family was all over the country, and I became fascinated by the differences in the different regions, et cetera. So I definitely wanted to make them put my characters in a position of having to create their own communities, whether that be within one's family or within one's friends or the workplace, which is often a common place that we make those deeper connections once we get past the small talk. So I had no idea the Shell plant existed either, and had no idea the extent, like Sarah said, of the war machine. It really was amazing. So the fact that it was there, once I kind of stumbled on it, it became my perfect setting.
Great. Sarah, do you have any other additional thoughts?
I guess I would just add that I felt like that aspect of this book really fits well with the sort of broader historical experience of lots of people. During this time period, there were men and women who were moving to a variety of different places specifically for these jobs and plants. So there were lots of people that were moving from state to state to try to get these factory jobs. And so they were very much having to create new communities wherever it was that they ended up.
Great. I think all of us probably know a little bit about what that feels like.
Yeah.
The women workers in the novel are viewed and see themselves as real life Rosies, that is Rosie the Riveter. How did being a Rosie give women social and economic opportunities during the war?
I would say it brought down some barriers that might have been there before. It gave them some options to kind of try on a new skin, and like they once the characters decide to be involved in a contest that's in the book, they put a team together, and they realize that they have to that some skill sets actually transpose. So if you're able to raise a household, you're able to multitask like anybody's business. So that they kind of put those things together, and then also got to know each other to the level where they knew each other's strengths, and realized that the sum of the parts is sometimes greater than the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So sorry, I'm not saying that correctly, but yeah. So sorry, I'll let Sarah go.
We get you. Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I would just add that this was new jobs in a lot of cases for many of these women. They were being able to work in occupations that they maybe had not had any access to prior to the war. So there was very much a sense of newness, and women were being provided not only with an opportunity to prove themselves, but they were having to prove themselves over and over and over again in each of these new positions. But it did, I think, give a lot of these women more confidence than they may have had before, by virtue of having that extra economic independence, of having that wage paying job that maybe they hadn't had prior to the war. So it did provide a lot of new ways of looking at social and economic opportunity for many women, even if that didn't necessarily stay the case in the post-war era.
Yeah, one of the things as I was sort of researching the characters, and you kind of interviewed your own characters. So I needed to come up with a narrative for why both of them went to work. So in Maggie's case, and I didn't realize this, but they really, once America got into the war, they really thought they never thought it was going to take 3.5 years to get done. They really thought it was going to be 18 to 24 months. And so they made the plans. They had a soldier's wage for Maggie's husband, who was at war, but it wasn't lasting. And so she really did, she had to go to her in-laws or go to work. And so I wanted that sort of, you weren't desperate for extra income, but you really did need it. In Cora's case, the most Black women could go from making $3 a week in a white woman's household to making $25 to $30 a week in these plants. So that was a huge game changer, So I wanted to make, once Cora got into the plant, for her to recognize that as the opportunity, and she wanted to buy a house, and so those motivations I wanted to play out within the dialogue between the two of them, and also kind of what their motivations were.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really loved about the way that you wrote the characters there, was the fact that they did have these different kinds of perspectives and a little bit different backgrounds and reasons for getting into this kind of job, but pointing out that it's very necessary. I think there's frequently this sort of misconception that women during World War II all worked just because they were patriotic. And there were plenty of women that did work for those reasons. But there were also a lot of women like Cora who had been working before the war because they had no choice. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of women like Maggie who, for a variety of different reasons, were right on the cusp of not being able to support their household on just their spouse's income. So they did feel that extra pressure to go ahead and step into the workforce, and might have anyway. But yeah, that's one of the things that I really appreciated about your book, was that you talk a lot about these different perspectives that women would have had at that time.
Yeah, and part of my research, I had no idea that Roosevelt had done an executive order even before America got into the war that eliminated racial discrimination from the defense industry only, because it would be 20 years later when the Civil Rights Act would come into play. So that was fascinating to me. So I realized that this was a very simple labor shortage, so bending all these rules and letting women in, letting people of color in was a necessity. And I wanted to explore, how and why and how it might have felt when the tree snapped back. So.
Love it. It's fascinating stuff. It really is. Okay, the characters both experience instances of racism and sexism in the book. How do those experiences personally affect characters like Cora, Maggie, and Lieutenant Owens, and their relationships?
Lieutenant Owens was a really fun character to write. So she was a lot of, some of the people I worked with in the past that sort of their rules that they were following or mirroring, I guess, were ones that were designed by men. I mean, the military is just a very men-centric, I guess, way of leading. So I really wanted to explore that she was teaching Maggie how to become a supervisor, and Cora eventually how to become a supervisor. And so how they sort of could look at Owens and see if that's how they wanted to lead, or if they wanted to take their own cues and examples for how to lead a little bit differently. And I guess everyone kind of has to decide what that is. But once you kind of remove some of those barriers, it was a fun subject to play with and to write.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I really appreciated the discussion there of how Owens was considering her own leadership skills. That was definitely something that military women were having to deal with a lot during this era. There was a lot of pressure on military women to somehow be both completely feminine and, embody that sort of idealized image, while at the same time, they were supposed to be stepping into this very masculine coded world and being able to keep up with the boys and laugh in the face of sexist jokes and things like that. And I think Owen's character is a really good example of how some of those things play out.
Yeah. There's a scene where Owens tells her, your job is to make him forget that you're a woman. And she looks down at her, pantyhose and high heels and whatever. She's just like, this is pointless. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we still, we experience that still today. It's still dynamics that are playing out.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see some of the historical context. Okay, the next question. Were Cora and Maggie changed by being friends with one another? And this is a multi-part question. So maybe I'm going to ask the first two first. Okay, so were Cora and Maggie changed by being friends with one another? How were women in general changed by their experiences on the home front during World War II?
Well, I'll take the first one if Sarah would take the second one. How's that?
Great.
So I do think they were changed by how they learned from one another. So they both end up being in maybe some uncomfortable circumstances where they were both the minority in certain instances. Cora was probably a lot more used to being that than Maggie was. but it helped them see through each other's perspective, and kind of stick to their own principles, no matter what the different circumstances. And that was really important for me to write Cora as that. So she had, and I think, and also I had, it was hard to write Charlie and James, who were their spouses, because they are never actually there except for the some of the end chapters. And but you had to, kind of make them come to life. And so I really wanted James to, instill in his wife that, there are certain things that he did not want her to do in terms of, cooking for, cooking or working in cafeteria or what have you. And she kept those principles. She said, I'm not going to work unless it's this job. And so, Maggie had to go back and help her get that job. So that was, something I wanted to display in the principles, but I also I did not want to have, kind of a white savior complex, which is common in a lot of friendships that are displayed multiracial perspective. So, and I think that was really the benefit of my writing cohort. They were really adamant about that. And if I ever got in that direction, they'd say, no, let's keep it over here. And then my editors, and also my sensitivity readers, which I relied on very heavily. So.
Great. Sarah, do you want to take the second part?
Sure. I would like to actually just respond to Meredith real briefly there too, because that was one of the things that really struck me about the book, was the fact that Cora and Maggie have these very different perspectives and different ways of seeing the world. And they come into conflict occasionally because they don't completely understand each other. And they manage over the course of the story to not necessarily always completely understand each other, but to find ways to be friends anyway. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really beautiful aspect of the book. As far as thinking a little bit more broadly about women and how they were changed by their experiences on the home front, I think a lot of women experienced new independence. They had different expectations for the future than maybe they had before. There were also, I think, a larger number of women who were more comfortable looking for jobs later on. Now, we get at in the book about how in the immediate post-war era, many women were pressured to leave their jobs. And, that was something that was happening all over the country. But more of these women, like in the years that would come after that, actually would be more willing to think about going back and potentially working part-time or looking for something that they found really fulfilling to do than they might have in the pre-war era. And of course, pointing out that women who had to work before the war, because there were, of course, lots of women who did work, they would need to continue working after the war as well. And this was complicated by this push for women to leave the workforce in the immediate post-war era, because they had taken on these nice factory jobs that paid a lot better, had better benefits, and they were being pushed to leave those to returning veterans if the job wasn't going away entirely. And they were being kind of forced to return to jobs that generally paid less money than they had before. So they had a little bit different expectation for what they should be getting paid for their work at that point as well. And even the women who did completely leave the workforce for some time after that, I think many of them had different expectations for their daughters. Mm-hmm. Whereas they may have believed for themselves that working outside of the home was not for them. If their daughters were interested in looking for some kind of wage work, going to school, going to college, things like that, these women were, I think, more likely to actually see where their daughters were coming from and want to support them in those endeavors.
Yeah, and I did interview several. Unfortunately, by the time I had the idea for the story and discovered the Shell plant, many of the people who'd worked there were no longer living. But I did interview several of their daughters, and that's what. Well, that is what they said. Exactly what Sarah just reflected. But also they were surprised that their mothers didn't talk about it more. Once they kind of knew about it, they would even ask them, and they I think they got so used to not talking about it during the war because you just didn't know who was a spy and you didn't know who to trust, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I think we sort of peanut butter history a little bit and think everyone knew how long it was going to take and everyone knew we were going to win, and that just wasn't the case. It really was a lot of really gut wrenching uncertainty of what their future was going to bring, future of the world, really. And so when they would, play that out in terms of the jobs that they had, I think that was the fun thing to portray about that. So.
Well, and even though there's not a immediate women's rights movement that comes out of this, I think it does provide that basis for the women's rights movements that come up a few decades later, because women are reflecting back on these experiences that either they had when they were young women or that their mothers had, and using that as inspiration for pushing for greater rights, in the 1960s and 1970s.
Wow, I was actually going to even ask that question. I was thinking I was like, setting the stage for the future. It had to have had some basis in that.
Yeah, the best compliment a reader can give me is to say that they were, up at 2 a.m. down a Google rabbit hole. Like, I can't believe this existed and I didn't know about it. And what else didn't I know about this time period? But also, so that's sort of going in the past, but also projecting into the future. Like, what do you think Cora's role might have been in the end of World War II was really the birth of the civil rights movement. I mean, that took years to come about, but it really was the double V for victory at home and victory abroad. And then what Cora and Maggie's role might have been in that Equal Rights Amendment era. So.
We've talked about this a little bit already, but I want to hear if you guys have any additional thoughts. Did women's experiences during this time have long-term effects on women in the modern workforce?
I mean, I would say that they did. Again, it's not a direct one for one. We see immediate change. Equal Rights Amendment comes immediately after women working in World War II kind of thing. But even though there is this sort of retrenchment in the immediate post-war era, I think that it does have a real impact later on what women are willing to do, what they're able to do, and where they see themselves going, what they see for themselves. So I think it really does have a major impact on the women in the workforce later on.
Yeah, great.
Well, I just loved all the answers to those questions. I even wrote down "be friends anyway." I think that's just like a beautiful summary of like how to live.
Yeah.
Everybody has differences and should be friends anyway.
I agree.
So is there anything that either of you are currently working on that you would like to share with the audience? I'll start with Meredith.
Sure. I would love to write a children's book. I've not done so yet, but I'm working on it. And then I would love to write a second historical fiction novel. That's always my go-to genre. It's my genre as a reader and definitely as a writer. And the idea I am exploring is based not in Charlotte, but in Tombstone, Arizona, which was a very manly town, but it had some really strong women. So that's what I like.
Great. How about you, Dr. Patterson?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say, yeah, I got to the end of the book and I wanted to know what happened next too. So, a sequel to Poster Girls would not be unwelcome at all.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many really cool questions at the end of the book that it would be really cool to follow up on some of that. As far as my work, I am currently in the process of editing a manuscript looking at women reservists from the Marine Corps during World War II. It's a kind of a broader work that looks at gender in the Marine Corps, but it does have a large segment of it that is specifically about women Marines in World War II. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Fascinating. Kudos to both of you. I am at this point going to hand it over to some of the NC Humanities staff to see what questions we have from all of our participants and go through some of those.
Thanks, Laura, voice from beyond, but keep sending us those questions in the Q&A feature. We really appreciate those, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can. Meredith and Sarah, thank you so much for a great conversation. Look forward to hearing the answers that you have for some of these questions. So first, I want to ask Meredith, this question comes from Jennifer. Did you interview elder Black women who were alive during this time, or their daughters or descendants of these plant workers? And how did you kind of help write Cora's voice? Did any of that inform her voice?
I tried. I really did. I actually went to several historically Black churches in Charlotte, trying to find somebody who might have done that. I went to several historians, and they put me again to those daughters whose mothers worked at the plant. So unfortunately, I was not able to talk directly to a person of color whose either mother worked there or they worked there themselves. But I did base a lot of Cora's spirit on a book that I read called Rosa Parks in My Words. And so she really, I guess when I read that book, I was just struck by how we feel that we know Rosa Parks, and she just was a nice lady who decided she didn't want to sit on in the back of the bus that day. And that was not true at all. It was a very well orchestrated, very well planned event. She knew exactly when to get on the bus, actually, who was going to meet her at the courthouse as soon as she got arrested. It was and just wanting to know people, to know what her actual story was and why she did it, what her motivations were. It's a great book. And so I based a lot of Cora's spirit on that book. So because I just really appreciated Rosa Parks more than I ever did in any other history lessons that I had on her. So that was one of my sources. And then of course, my sensitivity reader was excellent. So everything that she told me to change, just to, someone who lives life from that perspective, and I do not, then I changed all of it. And they were the best suggestions. So.
Meredith, can you tell us a little bit more about what a sensitivity reader is?
Oh, sure. Yes. So that'd be somebody that maybe has more in common with a character than the writer themselves might. So, I mean, I'm not a purist in terms of, men can't write women characters and vice versa. And people of color can't write for white characters, et cetera. But you do need to consult with somebody who has that perspective, whether it be LGBTQ, or whether it be people of color, or anything, someone with a handicap or a disability per se, someone, a Native American. So if you have that, if you've written a character that has some of those challenges, you want to check in with somebody called a sensitivity reader that would be able, that knows those because they've experienced them themselves. And they would be able to say, yes, this is accurate. You might want to change this. And so, that was very important to me to explore.
That's a great explanation. I appreciate you sharing that. And it sounds like that was really helpful for you in your writing. So good to know.
Very much so. Yeah.
That's great. Kind of dipping back into the first question I asked, we have a question here asking about how you initially learned about the plant.
So I had the idea in 2017. And I kind of asked myself the question of, well, how do women lead? And I couldn't answer that. So I knew I wanted to make it sort of for lack of a better term, like a women's leadership parable. And someone told me that's boring, so don't describe it that way. But I really did want it to be an example for how women can lead differently and sometimes more effectively than some of the other standards they might see in the workforce. And so I knew that, and they say when you're writing your first novel, write what you know. So I knew I wanted to be about Charlotte. It's my hometown. I knew I needed it to be in World War II because, no offense to any gentlemen out there, but that men kind of complicate things. So I needed them to be gone. And so in order to explore how women, do lead. So that was important. So then I had, the city, I had the time setting, and then I just needed sort of a specific setting within the city itself. And so I had just been to Camp North End and was so impressed by it because it had just opened. And I thought, oh, for sure, that was something really cool in World War II. And it turns out it just shipped out supplies. So it was kind of boring. But in doing that Google search, because Google was just everybody's resource, shell plant kept coming up in the search. And I was just like, what is this thing? And so I started diving in, and it just was really providential. It became the perfect setting for the novel. So I stumbled upon it.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. I want to switch now to a question about the book cover. This participant asks, Rosie the Riveter appears as an African-American on the cover of the book. Were women of color ever featured as Rosie the Riveter images during the time of World War II?
I did research several posters. That's why it's called Poster Girl, because, posters was sort of the OG social media, right? It was the influencers of the day. There were posters everywhere. There were posters in the post office, in the grocery store, in churches, in schools, and in what have you, community centers, that were sort of telling them how to be, how to feel, how to act. And there were several posters that said, kind of united we stand, and it would have a Black person working next to a white person. And that was, promoting we're all in this together kind of thing, which is a great concept. It would have been nice if it had continued, afterwards. But it was definitely part of addressing that later labor shortage at the time. And then, but I did not find many. Unfortunately, Black women just were not represented at all in these posters. So it was unfortunate. So I wanted to. That's why I wanted to, represent. And I feel like she kind of looks like a little bit of every woman, So, but probably more person of color than not. And she's my friend now. So she's a local influencer herself here. So, but yeah, so that was fun to do with the cover, because I wanted it to appear like the Rosie image, the every woman image was coming down, and it was being replaced by the image of a model. So.
It's iconic. Sarah, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that question about Rosie the Riveter and representation during that time?
Sure. Like Meredith said, in the research that I've done, I've really not run across any images of Rosie specifically that date to that time period that are women of color. There are other posters for a variety of different things. The United We Stand ones, I think, are an excellent example of that do feature people of color, but there do seem to be fewer of them, and they were not as widely distributed as many of these other images.
If anyone has ever found one, I would love to see it. So yeah, it'd be great. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
I'd love if it was out there. Yeah. Yeah.
Send it in the chat, link in the chat.
That's right. Yeah. Pinterest
Sarah,
might have something.
exactly. Sarah, I want to ask you a question as well, and Meredith, of course, feel free to jump in as well. This participant asks, some historians have talked about how World War II opportunities for women opened up possibilities for who they were previously trapped within heteronormative worlds to explore same-sex relationships and identities. Could you talk a little bit more about this, and if you've ever, run into this in your research?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And I haven't dealt with that too much in my work, but there's some really good historiography on that. And now I'm blanking on names. Lisa Myers is a historian who has dealt with this exact issue, as well as Marilyn Hegarty. And they both look at how within the context of women in the military, there is this concern about maintaining heteronormative, heterosexual relationships, even when there's supposed to be this lack of men around. That ideal is still there and is still very much being put forward by the people in charge of the military at that time. So I think that is that's a really important piece of the ideology and the social norms that are being put forward at that time.
It's probably also a way to make people afraid of anything that was different, whereas before that might have been they were leaning towards it because they needed to, and then now it was go back into your lanes kind of thing.
Yeah. I want to ask a question now too, a little bit about, the context and where this is taking place. So we have a participant who wants to know, were there any other large wartime manufacturing facilities like the one in the book in other North Carolina cities?
Oh, Sarah would know that, right? I think there was one in Raleigh. Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually fairly new to the state, so I'm still learning North Carolina history. But they were everywhere. So I would be really surprised if there were not other similar plants in other parts of North Carolina. It would, quite frankly, shock me.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody had also asked for those authors' names again. Those were Marilyn Hegarty and Lisa Meyer.
Sarah, do you want to expand that last question? Are there any other facilities that maybe you can think of in the country, maybe not necessarily North Carolina, but I mean, was this a common thing, or doesn't seem to be just North Carolina, right?
Yeah, it was happening all over the country. As we talked about a little bit ago, there were plants like the ones in Detroit that were making other kinds of items, things like automobiles before the war, that were shifted to wartime production, building all sorts of things for the military. But there were also these brand new plants that were popping up all over the place. Some of them were converted at the end of the war to peacetime production. Some of them were actually abandoned because they just didn't need quite so many plants as they had when they were building for wartime.
Yeah, that's what happened to the shell plant. So it was in the Steel Creek area of Charlotte, and it just went back to the Navy. So, and I don't know if anyone is asked about the corporate military partnerships. Those were popping up kind of everywhere. So in each one of these, like Sarah said, that either a factory that was making X now changes to make, some kind of a piece of ammunition or a ball bearing or what have you, to keep sort of the military machine going. They would come in that someone that military or the corporate partnership would always usually take place with the military partnership. So either the Army, the Air Force did not exist then. I did not know that. The Army, the Navy, or the what's the other one?
Coast Guard.
Was it Coast Guard?
Yeah, there's the Army, Air Force. That's
Yeah, Air Force and
part of
Marines.
the Army.
Yeah, they
Yeah, the
weren't
Marine Corps.
around. Yeah, so one of those three would have come in and met with the and said, we will handle all the assets. We will help you change the plans. We will provide the materials or whatever, and we ask that you manage the labor. So that was the sort of what the corporation would do, would manage the labor, and then then all the assets from the shell plans once the war ended, and literally these people were fired at 2:30 in the afternoon as soon as the Japanese signed that surrender on that ship. And so they that went over back to the Navy, and they used it as a training facility. It kind of sat empty for 10 to 15 years. And now it's a big, there's a bunch of factories, a big industrial park here. And Carowinds was part of the plant. So if everyone knows Carowinds, it's at one point part of the footprint because it was 2,200 acres in total.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah, you could have fit 6 Carowinds inside the footprint of this thing. So it was big.
Holy cow.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah and Meredith. Meredith, I want to ask you now, and of course, Sarah, feel free to jump in, but why did you introduce the character of Leland? Moreover, how did you plan his role to help with Maggie, and was he necessary?
They say when you're writing a book, throw as many obstacles in front of your characters as you can. So I wanted it to be that, I needed a little love triangle going, and it was hard to have a love triangle with someone who was kind of far away or off to war. So I put Leland in there, and I thought, because I had a writing class, I took a year-long writing course, and I had a writing coach during that time, and they were great because they would challenge me at every kind of step. So I would think, well, it happened this way. And they would always ask the question of, well, why would that be? Or would that really be? How would Cora come to work at the plant? Because as it played out, and it really isn't documented on how many and when people of color came to work at the plant. There really just is one brochure that was published by the U.S. Rubber Company, which was the corporation that ran the labor. They published one brochure, and it did have, I think 10 or 11 lines were in it, and it named 2 as colored lines, and that's all it really said. So there just wasn't a ton, again, because it was still top secret, et cetera. And they liked Charlotte where it was as a location because it was East Coast, but not right on the East Coast where the German U-boats were and that kind of thing. So they enjoyed, the location, and then there was the whole, loose lips, sink ships kind of thing. So they just didn't talk about it. But yeah, that was I think I answered the question. Sorry, I lost
Thank you. No, that's what we're here for. We appreciate you sharing your perspective on it, of course, and your thoughts.
Yeah. So sorry. So Leland was the way that Cora could come to work at the plant early on, and that she would be a part of the group of white women, and she would be the minority. But then she, as the friendship came about, she could then ask Maggie to be the same thing with her friends, and so that was that experience. So otherwise, I really don't know how, if Maggie hadn't had it in with, getting Cora the job there, I'm not sure she would have had the job there that early on. So.
Well, Meredith, I've got another plot-driven question for you, maybe character-focused question. This participant would like to know, was Lieutenant Owens meant to be an enabler at the end during the contest, or did she try to sabotage?
Well, I don't know if she could have, that shell could have been empty or not empty, or, she could have meant it for her team or for Maggie's team. So that's a great question. I kind of wanted to leave that part of it open. But I also, when I'm a reader, I love for every character to have an arc. So it was important for me for every character to kind of, have to understand what their motivations are, and then maybe where they had some challenges, and then maybe they learned something and they were a little bit changed at the end. So I tried to do that for Grace, the mother-in-law. I tried to do that for Maggie, for Cora, well, not so much for Leland, but but definitely for Lieutenant Owens, because I learned in my research that, there were, I think, 13,000 women who volunteered in World War I, and then like 300,000 that volunteered for World War II, and none were allowed in the military in between. So I wanted them to understand that they were like, this is it. This is our chance to be able to stay in. But they're still women, and they still understand at a base level of the challenges that could that came with working in kind of a man's world. So in the end, she does help them a little bit, and then she goes back to her demeanor. So.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to break up this next question a little bit. We've got a participant who would like to know kind of about job roles and, with women coming into one, how did that affect it later on? So this participant wants to know, do you think a woman in a particular role that was previously only occupied by a man had an effect of diminishing that job at all because it was changed to a woman's role in the workforce? So maybe Sarah or Meredith, you can talk a little bit about how, these jobs may or may not have changed after a woman may have taken it on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we do see a lot of that. There are a number of historians that have looked into this issue in some detail, but particularly thinking about things like clerical work. That was something that initially was considered to be sort of a masculine occupation. And then I think starting kind of during World War I, when they were initially having women into the military and into government jobs in increasing numbers to make up for labor shortages then, it started to be something that was more acceptable, and then later almost kind of coded feminine in some ways. So it's certainly women entering particular occupations, I think, did have an impact on how those particular jobs were perceived long term. I think that's absolutely true.
I remember my aunt telling me that she had 3 career choices. She could be a nurse, she could be a teacher, or she could be a secretary. And those were really the only options that were out there. So she became a nurse, for whatever reason. But I think, I don't know, how many, as far as like in factory work, how it might have changed. Although there might be the more dangerous factory work that would have stayed. But there were women obviously riveting, airplanes, that kind of thing. So I think that might have kept with the gender norms even after the men came back. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. It's a great question though.
Yeah, I think a lot of that had to do with women being pushed out of those jobs that were seen as being a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more strenuous, but they were also frequently higher paying. And so when you have all of these veterans coming back, those were some of the first jobs that women were kind of pushed out of. And so, yeah, I think Meredith, you're absolutely right about that, some of those positions didn't shift as much as maybe some things would as a result of that.
But if you really want to know about because obviously within Roosevelt's executive order that was done in 1941, it only banned racial discrimination. Gender discrimination was not attacked until, if you want to watch the RBG movie, that's a great one to watch, because she was an attorney and there were no women attorneys, or there was one, I guess, that was willing to hire a woman attorney, but she went for an interview and they're like, oh, sorry, we already hired our one woman. We don't need another one. I always remember that for that movie. So
there are so many good resources out there. So we're happy to add this one into the pool, especially during Women's History Month. So thanks again for being here, all of us. One last question I have here. This participant has asked, Meredith, was it hard for you to write about the husbands coming home to these working women? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of how you structured that.
Yeah, for a long time, I didn't know what was going to happen to either one of them. And so I sort of played it out with various scenarios. And, I knew I wanted to explore someone not coming home, someone coming home fairly whole, and mentally, okay, and then someone not coming home in that state. The other thing that I learned in my research, I had no idea the differences between the Pacific theater and the European theater were completely different ball games in terms of what they were exposed to and the challenges that they faced in the morale and all that kind of stuff. So those things, and also that really, I think Maggie and Cora knew that she knew James was somewhere in Europe. She knew that Charlie was somewhere in the Pacific. But that was really it. You really had no idea where they were. They couldn't say where they were. It was all through kind of letters and the communication that they held on to, and tied with the red twine, that kind of thing. So that was something I did not necessarily understand, was how different it was. So I liked the way that I came up with it in the end. It kind of explored all three of those, but I wanted them to also have a win. And so one of my favorite chapters is when Roosevelt dies, the day Roosevelt dies, and one of the husbands comes home. I won't ruin everything for, but that was one of my favorite chapters to write.
Yeah, I've done a lot of historical work on the Pacific, and particularly looking at POWs in the Pacific. So I was really pleased when I was reading this book, and you really draw attention to the fact that the conditions that German POWs were under were very different than Japanese POWs.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you did that I really liked was having these German prisoners that were in the United States, because that was another thing that was also going on. And they were being treated very differently than prisoners of war that were in Europe or in various places in the Pacific as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
my understanding is a lot of them worked on farms,
Mm-hmm.
and they after the war was over, they came back. Like they liked it that much. So the German, and that is not actually is a true story by a woman who grew up in Myers Park, and her 4 brothers were fighting in the war, and the 2 German prisoners, or I don't know how many, maybe it was 3 or 4 German prisoners, were building a road near her house, and gum was a big deal back then. So the Red Cross was you couldn't get gum unless you were either injured or in the army or what have you. So the Red Cross had some dominion over all the gum, I guess, because it gets mentioned with James as well. But yeah, so they gave them gum, and they kind of struck up a little friendship. So that was a story that was written in Charlotte Magazine in 2013 that I found, and I just loved it. So I wanted to explore that and explore just some of the similarities of what it means to be, a prisoner of war, and how she would see that and just hope that the same thing was happening somewhere with Charlie. So.
Again, learning new things every day. I've got one more question here. So if anyone has any other thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Please put those in the Q&A feature. Really appreciate how engaging everyone has been so far. And thanks so much for adding your thoughts in the chat. This question asks, or rather states, in their local conversation about this book, It came up that several attendees had shared that their own mothers who had worked during World War II don't really talk about their experiences that much. And this participant is wondering how common that is, maybe in this particular instance, but maybe just across, different things that you all have read and researched.
It's almost everyone I've talked to said the whole loose lips, sink ships, they got so used to that while the war was going on, and they were so glad that the war was over. It just became just emotionally very easy to slip into not talking about it at all. So they just moved on.
Yeah, that's largely what I've come across in the historical research that I've done as well. And in addition to that concern with secrecy, there's again also that, relief that the war is over and wanting to move on to the next thing. And with gender norms not necessarily having changed immediately, many of the women got used to just not talking about it that much because that was not their post-war reality. So by the time that they were feeling a little bit more comfortable with the idea of talking about that, it was later enough that it was not quite so fresh on many of their minds, I think.
Yeah, some of the daughters I talked to whose mothers worked at the plant, they remembered that they remember their mothers wearing a lot of blue. Everything was blue. They remember them carpooling, and they remember them, laughing with their coworkers. So I wanted to explore that.
That's a beautiful way to end that thought, laughter. Meredith, I want to just open it up and say, is there anything that we didn't get to talk about tonight that you would love to share with our participants about the book or about your process or just, anything in general?
No, I'd just love to express that appreciation for everyone who dialed in tonight, everyone who read the book, who tells somebody to read the book, who gives a review for the book. That is a way that it will find, a more national audience and just kind of grow. I mean, I love that the power of word of mouth. I've always been a big advocate of that, and I'm just so pleased that the book is resonating with people's hearts, like it did with mine. So I appreciate everything, and I appreciate NC Humanities for choosing it.
Absolutely. Sarah, did you have anything that you wanted to add as well?
I don't think so, actually. I think we got to most of the major historical points that I made note of as I was reading. But I did want to say also that I very much enjoyed having the opportunity to read the book. So thank you for writing it, Meredith.
Thank you. And to say I got things historically accurate, I was a terrible history student. Makes me so happy because I love history, but it has to have a story behind it or I never remember it. So that's why I like historical fiction. So.
Well, I definitely want to thank both Meredith and Sarah. I saw so many comments in the chat about people really connecting with this book on a family level, generational level, where they knew someone. I saw someone said that they had someone recently who passed away who was like one of the oldest or the oldest living female Marines. So a lot of these stories kind of come down through the generations, and these connections are not lost at all to history. So I want to thank Meredith and Sarah for their conversation this evening, and to Laura for moderating and asking such great questions and getting all of this wonderful conversation together. So I also want to say thank you to our audience for attending and for asking such amazing questions. We appreciate your time and engagement. At the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete. We would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. You can also visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about other upcoming events and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. Our next North Carolina Reads virtual book conversation will be on Wednesday, April 24th, 2024 at 6:00 p.m. on Zoom webinar. We will discuss our April selection, American Refuge, True Stories of the Refugee Experience with author Dia Abdo and Dr. Omar Ali in a conversation moderated by Cecilia Thompson. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a great evening.